Picture this. You're settling into your seat on a massive Boeing 777. The engines spool up, roaring to life, and you're smoothly pushed back into your seat as hundreds of tons of metal hurtle down the runway. Up front, sitting in the left seat, is the captain, the absolute ultimate authority on that airplane. You trust them with your life, right? You just assume they've got every possible credential required to fly you safely across the ocean. But what if the person commanding that multi-million-dollar machine was hiding a monumental secret? What if they'd been operating in the shadows of a massive deception, literally for decades? Well, in this explainer, we're unpacking one of the absolute most jaw-dropping stories in recent aerospace history. It's a 27-year aviation mystery that completely challenges everything we thought we knew about safety, trust, and the invisible systems meant to protect us up in the sky.
Okay, let's dive into this. The multi-million-dollar question we have to ask is, how? Modern aviation is often called the most heavily regulated industry on Earth, and for good reason. There are checks, double checks, and triple checks for everything from a loose screw to the exact pound of fuel loaded on board. So how on earth does a human being, the single most critical component of the entire flight, just slip through the cracks? How does a pilot rise up to the prestigious rank of captain on a flagship wide-body jet and fly for an entire career without holding the mandatory license to do so? To really understand how this happened, we actually need to start at the very end of the story, right when the whole house of cards came crashing down. The facade finally shattered on June 1st, 2026. Peel Regional Police, a law enforcement agency just outside of Toronto, knocked on the door of Geoffrey Wall. Now, Wall was a recently retired Air Canada captain, and they weren't there to ask him about some minor paperwork mix-up or an expired medical card. No, he was placed under arrest. I mean, the sheer gravity of a highly decorated, retired airline captain being hauled into police custody, it sent absolute shockwaves through the Canadian aviation community. It instantly raised massive red flags across the global aerospace industry. The stakes were incredibly high here, and the allegations, well, they were severe. The criminal indictment laid out exactly what authorities think went down. And honestly, the charges are staggering. Fraud, document forgery, possession of counterfeits. We're not talking about a pilot simply forgetting to renew a piece of paper, right? The investigation alleged an active, intentional, and sustained effort to deceive one of North America's largest airlines and Canada's federal aviation regulator. In an industry that is literally built entirely on a foundation of absolute trust and verifiable truth, these charges represent the ultimate breach of faith. Section 1. A decorated career. A hidden secret.
Let's move to and see how this builds over time, because to truly grasp the magnitude of this deception, we have to look at the timeline. Wall joined Air Canada back in 1998, and he flew for the airline for an astounding 27 years before retiring in 2025. It wasn't until January of 2026, after he had already hung up his wings for good, that the national regulator, Transport Canada, opened a review into his license and credentials. Fast forward 5 months later, and he's arrested. For nearly 3 decades, he successfully bypassed the administrative safeguards of a major legacy carrier. Just think about the sheer scale of that for a second. Thousands of flights, millions of miles, and countless passengers flown during that entire period. And a big part of the reason he was able to hide in plain sight for so long was his incredibly prestigious resume. I mean, he was a former helicopter pilot for the Royal Canadian Air Force. He was promoted through the ranks to become an Air Canada captain, but here is perhaps the most shocking detail of all. He actually chaired the Master Executive Council of the Air Canada Pilots Association. He was literally a union boss. He was a recognized leader among his peers, someone directly tasked with representing the professional standards of his fellow pilots. This impeccable pedigree almost certainly created a halo effect, because think about it. Who would ever suspect a decorated military veteran and top union official of faking his own credentials? No way.
Section 2. The missing license. Now, what's really interesting about this comparison is the exact technical reality of the forgery. What was the specific piece of paper that sparked this massive investigation? It's super important to understand that Wall wasn't just some random guy who had never flown a plane. He wasn't a total imposter who wandered in off the street like in the movies. The reality is way more nuanced, and it hinges on the super strict tiered licensing system that governs our skies. See, Wall legally held a commercial pilot license. That is a legitimate, hard-earned certification that lets you fly for hire, but he didn't hold an ATPL, an air transport pilot license. That is the required license to be the pilot in command of a large, multi-crew commercial jet like a 777. Instead, authorities allege he used fraudulent documents to convince the airline that he actually had one.
To put it simply, the ATPL is essentially the PhD of aviation licensing. It's a huge deal. It requires a massive number of logged flight hours, usually a minimum of 1,500, along with rigorous written exams that cover really advanced stuff like high-speed aerodynamics, complex meteorology, air law, and intricate aircraft systems. It proves you have the extreme level of knowledge and experience needed to manage a high-stakes, multi-crew environment. Now, you can be a first officer, a co-pilot, with a standard commercial pilot license in some places, but to sit in the left seat of a Boeing 777, the ATPL is a strict, non-negotiable legal requirement.
Section 3. The Safety Paradox. This brings us to a really fascinating, kind of counterintuitive twist in this whole mystery. So we've got a pilot flying illegally for 27 years. We're talking fraud, forgery, the whole shebang. Naturally, your immediate thought as a passenger would be, oh my gosh, I was in danger. But following the arrest, Air Canada came out with a very firm, objective, and honestly pretty surprising stance. They stated flatly that safety was not compromised. Now, just sit with that cognitive dissonance for a second. How on earth can an airline proudly assert that a man faking his ultimate licensing credential didn't compromise safety? To anyone outside the industry, it sounds like a total oxymoron. But within the strict parameters of aviation training, the airline's argument actually reveals a lot about how modern flight safety operates in the real world.
Here is exactly why the airline claims passengers were completely safe. Even though Wall allegedly faked that initial piece of paper, he couldn't fake his actual hands-on flying skills. Every 6 to 12 months, airline pilots have to step into these highly advanced full-motion simulators, and they are thrown literally every emergency in the book. We're talking engine failures right at takeoff, severe weather, total hydraulic loss, you name it. Air Canada pointed out that Wall underwent all of this recurrent training. He successfully met or even exceeded the criteria every single time. He continually demonstrated a high level of competency in the cockpit. So in other words, his physical ability to fly the plane and manage intense emergencies was completely real, and it was verified continuously, even if his foundational paperwork was basically a mirage.
Section 4. The Fallout and Fines.
So the crucial point is this. Practical flying ability does not excuse breaking the law. In aviation, the paperwork is honestly just as critical as the piloting itself, because the entire system relies on standardized compliance. Before the criminal courts even had their say, the regulatory hammer had to fall, and Transport Canada stepped right in. They issued a massive monetary penalty in the Ontario region amounting to $67,500. And this fine wasn't just a slap on the wrist either. It was specifically issued for multiple instances of exercising the privileges of a crew license that he simply did not hold. It's a pretty stark reminder that regulatory bodies have immense power to financially punish noncompliance, which is entirely separate from whatever jail time or criminal penalties might come down from local police.
Now, to their credit, once this crazy anomaly was finally discovered, Air Canada went into immediate damage control to permanently close the loophole. First off, they voluntarily reported the matter directly to the regulator. They definitely didn't try to sweep this under the rug. Second, they instantly initiated a massive, fleet-wide audit of their entire pilot group. Thankfully, they found 0 other instances of noncompliance. Wall was completely a lone wolf here. And finally, they completely overhauled their administrative processes. They mandated strict physical verification of original Transport Canada documents, basically ensuring that a simple photocopy or a clever digital forgery could never, ever trick the system again. And this brilliantly illustrates the core philosophy of modern aerospace. Air Canada noted that appropriate licensing is an essential layer of their multi-layered approach to safety. In aviation, we call this the Swiss cheese model. Basically, you have many layers of defense: training, technology, regulation, licensing, but each layer has little holes in it, just like Swiss cheese. If the holes ever line up perfectly, that's when an accident happens. In this specific case, the licensing layer completely failed, but the simulator training and competency layers held firm, preventing an actual disaster. The administrative foundation is there to ensure that even if one layer totally fails, the others are there to catch it.
As we wrap up this explainer, we're really left with a lingering, highly provocative thought. Geoffrey Wall was an expert pilot, a union leader, and a military veteran. Yes, his flying skills kept his passengers safe, but his 27-year deception exposed a startling vulnerability in the bureaucracy of the skies. It forces us all to ask, if a highly decorated captain could somehow bypass the foundational paperwork of aviation for nearly 3 decades, how many other critical safety layers in our world rely just a little too heavily on blind trust? It's a massive question, and it's one that airlines and regulators are going to be wrestling with long after the final gavel falls on this absolutely unprecedented aviation mystery.